You don't want to overbuild. All you need to get started with enablement in the early days is like your pitch deck, and you keep iterating on that.
Right.
A lot of what enablement looks like is really like product education. The relationship between the product team or the founders and the initial early sales team is super, super important. It's usually you're developing products really fast, right? And so you're just really teaching the go-to-market team, like, why are we building something? And then how does it work? Did that actually improve your sales conversation or that customer relationship?
What are the signals when it is time to hire an enablement person?
You should really only hire people when you really feel like pain. You're onboarding so many different sales reps. And then it's like, who's going to do all the training? That's the moment oftentimes where it's like, wow, we are behind in enablement.
Yeah.
I think in the early days, you want to hire really high agency reps who can figure out things on their own. And you want to find people who are okay with operating in sort of that fluid environment.
What kind of tech are early people using for enablement?
You basically just need a place to store content and places to create content. And so what's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Grow and Tell. I'm Alex Kracov, and I'm here with Eric Doty, my partner in crime.
Yeah, hopefully zero crimes are committed on this podcast today. Today we're talking about early stage enablement. So just to set the scene here, so in the early days of a company, there's a period where you've moved past that like founder-led sale. You've hired your first few sales reps, but you don't have a dedicated enablement person yet. And at this point, like you probably have a marketing person or team. You might have a sales leader, you might not. But now you do have a small sales team that needs training, collateral, process, support, all that. At some companies, this phase can last for a few years. Like we've been at that point at Doc for a few years now. Alex, you've been at this position both at Lattice and Doc. I've been the first marketing hire at 3 startups where this was the case. So today we're going to dive into what does good enablement look like during this period, like who should own it when you don't have a dedicated hire yet, and when do you know it's time to graduate out of this phase and actually hire your first enablement person. Yeah, so Alex, let's get right into it. So I'd like to start, like, let's just contrast, like, what does this early stage enablement look like compared to a more mature enablement program? Like, what are the biggest contrasts between the two?
Okay, so the way I think about enablement in the early days, and I guess we're going to talk about it kind of like post founder-led sales. I have like a little mini team, like maybe my company is like 15, 20, 30 people, right? Like what does enablement sort of look like in that sort of early stage? And, the way it's always sort of gone down, it's maybe not like, at least for me, is it sort of like lives in this world of tribal knowledge versus like documentation, right?
Yeah.
So when you're a super small company, everyone is either sitting in the same, physical room or virtual room in Slack, but it's a small enough company where, the way you sell your product and the way you support customers is kind of just like people just kind of figure it out and you talk about it and it lives in conversations and in Slack, and it's very often not written down. And it always kind of starts from the founder because they were the ones who, in theory, were doing founder-led sales and figuring out the initial go-to-market motion. And then that founder is kind of passing that tribal knowledge to like the first, go-to-market team, right? The first sales rep, the first marketer, the folks like that. And you're sort of like just talking about it all the time, right? And the reason why it kind of needs to live in tribal knowledge is you probably don't have product market fit yet, right? You might have some semblance of product market fit because you've started to hire a team, but you're definitely not in the like scale up growth phase. And so, you need to stay flexible, and actually writing a lot of things down starts to become, like a hindrance rather than something that is actually, going to help you accelerate growth. But then fairly quickly, it kind of moves from tribal knowledge to, okay, let's start to take some of the things that we've learned and document it. And the canonical example here is like your pitch deck, right? It starts to move from, okay, just the founder talking about it to let's start to systematize it a little bit and let's get a V1 pitch deck going that our first sales reps can start to use. And that's kind of the first phase of enablement, what it really starts to look like. And then I'd say last thing I'll say, and then I'll pass it back to you, is based off of the pitch deck, you also want to kind of set up the demo environment for success, right? I assume most of our listeners are demoing SaaS products, software companies, right? But the thing that you're pitching, right? You got to nail that down, and it's like the slide that you intro and talk about your product, but then also kind of your demo environment and how you actually go about like, showing the product to your potential buyers are kind of like the first things you got to think about enablement in the early days.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting too is in the later days, enablement seems to be a lot more about like standardization and driving consistency and okay, here's what works and let's make sure everyone does it, versus in the early days like you don't have that archetype of like this is the perfect customer for us, this is the perfect sales process, and that's actually a benefit, right? Because like you need to have like variety in how salespeople are approaching the problem, variety in who you're talking to, whether you're founders in the sale or not. Like all of these variables actually help to like help you learn quicker, basically. And like you don't have that like you don't want to enforce a process at scale that doesn't actually work, right? So you need like this experimentation phase.
Totally. You need to keep it super loose, right? Like at Lattice in the early days, we were selling, like first we were a goal OKR product, and then we moved into a performance review product. And if we had gone crazy on enablement on the goal product, it would have been a completely different persona, like COOs. It's a completely different product. And we would have just wasted a lot of effort, like doing crazy enablement around that. And same with Doc, right? Like Doc sort of went from this horizontal product, many different use cases, sales, customer success, investor data rooms, so on and so forth. And if we had done a crazy amount of enablement around that, it wouldn't have worked. We didn't even have a pitch deck in those early days. And so it's really once you kind of start to feel product market fit, you start to feel repeatability in your sales process, whether that's you as the founder who's doing sales or your first sales hire, that's when it starts to make sense to start to like slowly invest into enablement. But even like once you've figured it out, it's going to change. Like, it's going to keep evolving, and you really don't need a big enablement program until you're really expanding the team and hiring a bunch of folks.
Yeah, and one other thing you said to me when we were preparing for this is that enablement is like more product driven and maybe more technical in the early days. Can you say more about that?
I think that's driven mostly because, it all goes back to this product market fit thing of, the core team is obviously focused on the products. That's what you're bringing to the market. And you're kind of, the journey to product market fit is you're going to keep iterating the product to kind of, fulfill whatever the customer wants on the other side. And in that process, right, a lot of the knowledge of why you're moving the product in a certain direction needs to be transferred to the people on the front lines, the go-to-market teams. And so the relationship between the product team or the founders and the initial early sales team is super, super important. And it's usually you're developing products really fast, right? It is not like a once a year release where like we're going to train you on that, right? It is like daily, multiple times a day updates to the product. We heard this thing that this customer wanted. We're going to ship, a feature related to that. And so a lot of what enablement looks like is really like product education, right? It is like saying, hey, we added this blue button into the product because of this reason. Now you should show it off to the customers. And then, hey, go-to-market person, I actually want you to send me feedback on, was that a successful feature we just launched? And so you're just really teaching the go-to-market team, like, why are we building something? And then how does it work? And then there's this feedback loop of, okay, did that actually improve your sales conversation or that customer relationship, whatever it is? So most of it, is sort of, and that goes back to that tribal knowledge of just like teaching your go-to-market team how the product works. And that's like the most important part of enablement, in those really early days.
Yeah, and it feels like the main goal is just to get a really tight feedback loop between here's a new thing, make sure you understand it, tell us what the customer thinks, and then let's just keep improving iteratively.
Yeah. And one thing I observed at Doc, which is interesting, is like the early team, it's a slow drip of products. You sort of learn this stuff really over time as it gets released, right? It's pretty easy to keep up with it, right? Like what are all the different functionalities, because it's over, let's say, a year-long period that every week there's a new thing and I learn it and I figure it out. But then what eventually happens is you have a new employee joined. Like we had Sarah, a new customer success person, join last year. And then she's dropped in and it's like, oh my God, she has to learn so much about the product, right? There's like 3-4 years of product that has to kind of catch up and learn. And she didn't get the advantage of like Maddie, who slowly kind of learned it. And so that's when you start needing more formal enablement and training and sessions and things, because just the amount of things you have to learn just like, is so much more once the company has sort of like found its footing and it's more of a real thing.
Yeah, and that's a big call out, right? At a big company, the main job of enablement is onboarding, basically. And at a small company, very little onboarding is happening. Right?
Yes.
Like maybe one rep a quarter, maybe less than that, versus some of the other enablement leaders we're talking to on the show, they're onboarding hundreds of reps a month.
Totally. And I find especially people who you want to be a big company, right? That's every startup's goal. And especially if you're a founder or a founding team who came from a big company, right? Like you're used to all of this structure around. And so, we've been talking about this a little bit, but you don't want to overbuild. And what's really you can start really small and all you need to get started with enablement in the early days, is your pitch deck, and you keep iterating on that. Maybe you have one product demo video that you can record using Loom or Tela or something like that, just that showcases your product as a nice follow-up. You want to think about the follow-up after the demo and what are those little pieces of collateral that people need. And it's really those are the two core things. Maybe something around pricing too, and how you communicate your pricing and the sort of value there. But that's all you need to really get started. And then you can start adding more sophistication, around competitor enablement and different things as you start to scale.
Yeah. And what is the risk of over documenting in this case, or over processing too much enablement content?
You're just wasting time, and you're just you're just for example, Doc in the early days had 90 different competitors. And so if I was like, Eric, make a competitor battle card for 90 different competitors, that would have been useful.
I probably would have quit.
Yeah. That would have sucked. But it would have been useful for a couple months, right? But then, today Doc has sort of a core set of 3 to 4 different competitors. And so you would have wasted a lot of resources and time when actually that resource time could have better spent generating more leads or doing literally anything else. And so you just want to be sort of patient with the amount of documentation you build at a company in the early days. And then documentation also starts to feel like a little prison, because we've documented this is the way it has to be, even though actually in the early days you want tons of flexibility to kind of figure out what works the best.
Do you get pushback from reps in that scenario? I know sometimes reps come to us at Doc and say oh, I need competitive documentation on this. How do you communicate that as a founder to say this isn't worth our time, but at the same time you're telling the rep go sell against this competitor?
Yeah. So first, I think it starts with hiring a certain type of rep, right? I think in the early days, you want to hire really high agency reps who can figure out things on their own and can deal with sort of the ambiguity of not having the process or the documentation. And maybe if they don't have the documentation they need, they actually go make it themselves, right? You want that type of rep. Whereas it's really different than, when you're in sort of scale up mode where you want more coin operated reps who just follow a very specific process at specific stages and have all the documentation. You want somebody who can just plug into the system. And actually those high agency reps in that scaled up process usually cause random problems, right? And so it's a very different archetype of rep. So that's you want to find people who are okay with operating in sort of that fluid environment. But then you also want to really listen to them and be aligned to we're all on the same team. We all want the same goal. We want to close revenue. And so it's hey rep, what are the patterns that you're hearing? How can I be helpful to you to close more deals? Right. And, the obvious one that everyone runs into where it comes up is some competitor enablement, right? So maybe you don't go do those 90 that we were talking about before, but it's hey, sales rep, what's the top? If I was to make you one battle card, what's the one that you want to do, right? In the early days of Doc, we were really competitive with Aligned, and we were we need to make some competitor battle cards because our products are very different, so we need to explain that. And you just hear that multiple times. You maybe don't want to do things the first time a sales rep tells you to do it, but if you hear it again and again, and there's sort of a trend, then it's time to start to work on some things. And it often becomes a little bit more reactive in the early days of and just being a resource to your sales team and saying, hey, what can I do that would be helpful? I don't have a lot of bandwidth. I'm building the product. I'm the CEO. I'm doing all these things. But what's a small amount of things that I can do that would be helpful to support you? So that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah. And so we've been talking so far about what decent enablement looks like, but we haven't really talked about the who. So when you don't have an enablement team yet, it's likely these responsibilities are going to be distributed across people, right? It's probably going to be a bit of maybe one of the founders, someone in product, could also be a founder there though too, marketer, sales leader. Like, how do you think about those responsibilities and where they lie? And like, I mean, it's a big question, but like, what does collaboration look like between all those people?
As you sort of hinted at, it could be wildly different depending on like the founding team and who those early hires are. But I'll generally paint the picture maybe as roles, and like those roles can be either individual people or one person doing all the roles. So you have like, your product person, right, who's building the product, and that's an important role. Then you have the marketer who is really good at like writing and communicating and talking about the why and the positioning, right? And then you obviously have the like sales leader, who's going to help the frontline AEs, work with sort of be that bird's eye manager type of persona to think about more holistically the sales process. And then you might have operations, right, who's going to deal with all the systems, your CRM setup as sort of like the canonical example. And so those four roles, right, product, marketing, operations, and like sales leadership, like those could be four different people, or it could all be one single person, or it could be some random combination of things. And so, that just depends on like how much budget you have and how you want to hire and your own strengths as sort of a founding team. And so, like at Doc, my background's in marketing, and then Doc was sort of my first chance at really building a real product. And so, I guess, in the early days, I was kind of all of those things. Like pre-Eric, I was all of those things. And then Eric started to take on some of like the marketing responsibility of actually helping to do the collateral. And then Joey joined and started to be sort of the sales leader. But in the early days, it's like I'm standing up the CRM, I'm helping draft the first, pitch deck, different things like that. I'm not building the product, so talking about that. So yeah, that's kind of how I think about kind of the roles on the early, what early enablement looks like.
How different was it at Lattice? Was it a similar setup? Because not that you were green as a marketer, but like you were more green, and like your founder had a different skill set than you have at Doc. So what did it look like there?
Yeah, it was super different at Lattice. So, product was run by, so Jack, who is the CEO of Lattice, was sort of like the product vision. And so he would sort of think about like he was the one who's like, we're going to go build performance management, performance reviews. And so he's sort of the brain behind like why we're doing this and what this means, right, on that journey to product market fit. But then there was Ming, who ran product, and Jared, who is our product designer. They were the ones who really were talking about like what was the thing we are actually building and how is it going to work. And so they were responsible more on the product side of things. I was running marketing, so I would just think about like messaging and creating collateral all day. So I didn't have to think about, like, I was just getting kind of my orders handed to me from the product side of things. And then it's like, okay, translate that into nice marketing messaging that can be useful in sales. And then on the sales side of things, Lester was our first head of sales at Lattice. And he was the one who was like standing up our sales force and our CRM, right? I didn't even know how to do anything like that at the time, but that's kind of how we divided and conquered the role. So it was very, very different at Lattice.
Makes sense. Okay. And at Doc, you're the founder, and then you're taking on some of these sales enablement responsibilities. Like, how valuable do you feel that it is that you've stayed kind of hands-on? Obviously, I'm doing collateral, Joey's doing sales process, but like you're doing product training, you're doing, you're like helping with the messaging. Like, how valuable do you think that's sort of fed back into Doc as a product and like the rest of your like founder mode?
I mean, it's insanely valuable. I think the worst thing you can do as a founder or CEO is get far away from your customer and the things that they are saying. And I think one of the things that I really try really hard at Doc to do is to stay close to those customer conversations. And that can, like, I'm no longer on every sales call. Like it used to be, I was on every sales call, every customer call. I'm not on a lot of those anymore. But the way I do stay close is I like read every customer support ticket. I listen to a bunch of Fathom calls. I talk to the sales reps all the time. I see the our head of customer success, Maddie, and so I'm like intimately involved in what go to market looks like. What are the things? Asking a lot of different questions, and trying to, I guess, help guide what would be useful to them, right? That's all I think about enablement is, hey, what's going on in the front lines as you talk with customers? What can we do that would be useful, right? Is it another competitor battle card? Should we change our pricing? Should we update our demo deck? Different things like that. But I think what's evolved, and this is where you've played a huge role, Eric, is like, I don't have to spend time creating a lot of the collateral as much anymore, right? Like you own that, and you take my like crappy little ideas and make them look really nice and professional and things like that. And so you're able to sort of run with that. And I can kind of go back to more of like a traditional role, kind of like how maybe Jack was at Lattice, where it's like I'm thinking about the product and then communicating that to you and the frontline folks. And that's like, how it's starting to work now at Doc.
Yeah, and what's interesting is it creates a similar kind of, maybe tension's the wrong word for me, but there's a lot of value in me being involved in the sales enablement side now, because I learned so much about the customer. I learn what our sales process looks like. I learn what's coming up in conversations, and that feeds back so much into the messaging we write on our homepage, or what we say in a case study. Like a really good example is I learned sort of like what's a common blocker in our sales process, or what's a common question. Like for example, I'm really worried that my customer isn't going to open this doc workspace we send to them. So then as the marketing person, that allows me to, when I'm building the case study, to then make sure that I ask the customer about that and make sure that they sort of address that objection. So there's this really tight relationship between enablement and our content. But the tension that creates for me is like, I'm also responsible for the top of funnel and like demand gen and SEO and making sure that our salespeople are busy. So there's this constant kind of like push and pull between, oh, we need to go generate more pipeline, let's focus on that. And then it's, okay, now we actually need to flip and focus more on converting pipeline. So there's this like, it's reactive in a way, but I think the reactivity is necessary and positive, and that I'm always flipping between like filling the funnel and converting the funnel.
Totally. This is like the marketing dilemma, right? Like, marketing teams are gold on pipeline, as they should be, right? I think that's like the correct metric. But ultimately, a company is successful if it closes revenue, right? So you can generate as much pipeline as you want, but if it doesn't convert to revenue, it doesn't matter. And so I think more and more marketers need to be thinking about like the mid and late stage of the funnel and partnering with the sales team. And how do you do that? And then managing up to the CEO or whoever, and like figuring out what the right balance is between top of funnel growth and converting your existing pipeline. And some of that is also related to just like your average contract size, right? If you're selling super small contracts, you're an SMB business, it's probably all about top of funnel growth. But then if you start to have like 50K plus ACVs, it actually becomes more about the sales motion. It starts to look more like enterprise sales, and you're not going to have as many leads by definition. And so it becomes more important to convert them. And so you constantly need to like swing back and forth, as you said. And it just comes down to like managing up and setting those proper expectations, even though everyone's always going to force you at the top of the funnel. And like the glory in marketing is generating a lot of leads. But at the end of the day, it's all revenue that matters, and more marketers need to be focused on like the mid and bottom of the funnel.
Yeah, and you end up feeling yourself being pulled as a marketer. Yeah, when I joined Doc, like I don't know what our average contract was, maybe $1,000 a year, and now it's up more into like the higher figures, and I've felt myself be pulled from. When I joined, you're like, okay, we need to get 1 million website visitors. Like, I think our goal was like website visitors, because we thought like, okay, we're going to be very product led. It's going to convert into all these $50 a month users. We're going to have thousands and thousands of small users. And then our business models flipped, like we talked about on a previous episode, where now it looks more like enterprise sales. We're more sales led. And I felt myself be pulled very down funnel in terms of the kind of content that was valuable, like the comparison pieces between competitors, case studies, like those really became like the money content that we needed. And that kind of content served us dual purpose too. We're talking about being resource constrained. Whenever I'm making something in marketing, I'm like, can this also be used in the sales process? Like, can this also help us convert more? And I'm really finding that, there's if I'm going to make something, I'm like, can this serve dual purpose for me?
Yeah. And it's a really easy way to measure it, actually. It's just close rates. Like
Yeah.
close rates and time to close, right, are the two ways. And I think like more product marketers, I mean, this is product marketing is how I think about this
Mhm.
this side of marketing should be focused on that and gold around that. And obviously it's not as clean of a goal as leads, right? Because there's multiple people involved and multiple dynamics, right? It's not just a good enablement program that's going to lead a higher close rate, but sales obviously has a huge role, the product itself, right? But it helps. And so you should be able to see your close rates steadily increasing. And then especially around competitor close rates, you should be able to see it too. Like, are we doing a good job, outcompeting our competitors? Are our close rates going up against, the specific competitors? And you should be logging that in your CRM. And the product obviously has a big role in that, and the way sales communicates it. But marketing training and or enablement, helping train the sales team on that is just as important and plays a big role too.
Let's talk about tech. We are an enablement tech platform. We can't avoid discussion of this. What does the typical sort of enablement tech stack look like in the early days? And maybe that's a different question than what should it look like. But let's start with 101. What kind of tech are early people using for enablement?
Yeah. So the business world is basically divided between Google users and Microsoft users, right? And so most people will start with one of those two systems, right? And you basically just need a place to store content and places to create content. And so storing content is Google Drive or SharePoint or OneDrive, right? You should have a folder that you just like dump all of your battle cards and different things into, right? And then creating content is either Google Slides or Google Docs or PowerPoint or Word documents, right? So those are sort of the starting, tools. And then maybe a slight level, which a lot of startups are obviously using, are things like Confluence, where you start to kind of build more of a company-wide wiki, but then you might have some, sales enablement things in there. But as we kind of talked about at the beginning, most companies don't have a lot of documentation or shouldn't have a lot of documentation. So it's generally kept, lightweight. And then maybe two other things I'll say here on the sort of the starter pack, if you will. Like Figma or Canva, some like early design tool can be super, super helpful in making some like collateral, right? Like our early like one pagers or battle cards that we made at Doc, we would always design in Figma, and most, software companies, pretty much all of them have access to those tools. And maybe your product designer can kind of help on the marketing side a little bit to just make it look nice, because that does go a long way. A one pager battle card that has a little design polish is really important versus just, a black and white Google Doc. And then the other really important thing is your CRM. That's like obviously the central node of all go-to-market. And at Doc, that evolution was, we started with like an Airtable CRM when I was really just doing founder-led sales, and then graduated to HubSpot, which we've been really happy with at Doc. Some companies make the choice just to go straight to like Salesforce because they're like, we're going to be a big company, so let's just do it. We don't want to switch in the past. But that's generally what it looks like at the start.
Yeah. And then maybe let's talk about when does that start to break down? Because I know like at some point, something like Doc becomes helpful. And historically, and I think that's interesting too about the tool we're building, is that there was this big gap in the platforms available between, okay, your DIY and Google Drive and a couple Notion pages, and you're probably not ready for this world of Seismic, HighSpot, these like enterprise platforms. Like it's overkill for 5 to 50 sellers basically. So like what comes next after that? And like obviously we're using Doc at Doc. So like how does, my follow-up question to that as well is like, how do you think like dog fooding Doc has helped us like not just be that like DIY Google Drive company?
So the DIY solutions can work for a while, but what people start to notice is there's like it starts to break down in little areas. Like one example, right, is you're a Google shop and you're trying to sell documents to a Microsoft shop, right? And then the Microsoft user, your buyer, right, has to like log into Google. They don't have an account, right? This is like one of the classic annoying things that everyone deals with when they start to use these DIY solutions. Another thing that often happens is like you can't really tag content in a sophisticated way in Google Drive. You have to rely on folder structures. And so you can't have one piece of content live in multiple places. Like if you have a demo video that, or a one pager that's related to two different things, maybe it's for the sales team and a specific persona, you'd actually have to have that document live you have to have it in two places at once. That's really hard to do in a Google Drive. There's also very little visibility into what assets and resources the internal team is actually using. But more importantly, there's no visibility into is my buyer or customers actually engaging with this stuff? So am I creating enablement collateral in the right way? So you have really bad visibility, and then it's hard for people to find things. The problem with things in Google Drive and Notion is that those tools are still used for project management. I mean, my Google Drive folder is a disaster. I create Google Docs all the time for random things. We're reading from a Google Doc right now for our podcast notes, right? There's a lot of stuff in there. And so it becomes really hard to find what's the things that are client facing that I'm allowed to share, because it's so mixed in with the internal stuff. And so that's where a tool like, Doc, or, I'll call it more lightweight enablement platforms, start to be really useful. Is it starts to become a place where it's a really dedicated place for that revenue team to work, to organize all the client facing materials in one place. And that can look like a simple CMS, really a sort of a slightly more grown up version of a Google Drive that still integrates with Google Drive, but kind of creates destinations for the internal team to go to find the things they need. And built into that is easier discoverability and better analytics. And then, I'm very biased, obviously, in creating Doc, but deal rooms have been a huge driver of our own enablement, practice here. We never felt the need to have a super organized content library, for example, because we operate off of a deal room, and so when we think about enablement at Doc, we just think about our deal room template. And in the early days, this was super simple. It was a one-page deal room where it was, a little intro, maybe a lightweight mutual action plan with next steps, our pitch deck, demo video, and then once we got a case study, we would add that in there, right? And there wasn't a lot. It was super simple. But then as our sales process evolved, we started to add more pages into that deal room. And the pages at the top of the deal room really aligned with our sales process. And so we started to add things like business cases. We started to get a little more sophisticated around value selling. We'd build a whole case study page when we actually had a lot of case studies and videos and things we wanted to share. We started to build out different product pages that highlight the product in different ways. One for our different SKUs, right? One for sales deal rooms, one for customer onboarding, one for content management, one for Doc AI. And so it became this medium and a place where we could actually bring our sales process to life. And that is what I loved about the deal room. Is it can be really hard to talk about sales process in the abstract, but deal rooms are such a nice visual way for you to define that. And I love how it can really be created in line as your sales process gets created too. You can start small and then it can get super sophisticated as you get more sophisticated.
Yeah, what's been unique for me as the marketer at Doc is the visibility it's given me into the sales process. Because normally, unless I was sitting on calls at some of the other startups I've been at, you can't really get a sense of what the sales process looks like. So you get asked, I need this deck, I need this asset, and I don't really have the ability to push back and say, you don't need that, or, you say, okay, why? And sort of sell me on why I have to take my time to do this. Whereas at Doc, when I joined and we have the sales room, I can see exactly what the sales process looks like. I can see what the buyer's looking at throughout the process. And then that's, again, giving me that feedback loop of, oh, shoot, they're really looking at whatever case study videos. They're not actually reading the stories. I need to make more videos. So there was a lot of content visibility there, both in terms of what customers are looking at, but also just what the salesperson was doing. When I see this template, I know exactly how they're walking through. I can see them tagging customers in it. I just get a little more of a window, and that tiny window has given me a huge advantage in terms of feeding back into the actual enablement content strategy.
I was saying, it makes you feel better about your work too. I think what was frustrating me at Lattice is I had a team making all this enablement collateral and different things, and is this just like you're just sending it into the void, right? Like, is
Yeah.
this useful? I don't know. Like, I have a whole person that is getting paid whatever 100 plus K a year making stuff, and like, you don't know if it's useful or not. And like, that's what kind of drove me to go build, a tool like Doc, because like you want to have that really nice feedback loop between, marketing and sales, and obviously enablement's playing a huge role in there as well.
Yeah, no offense to sales, which that should be the tagline of our show. The official tagline of our show is no offense to sales, but they're very good at asking for the resources and flagging like what they're missing, but you don't often hear, oh, this thing that you did make is working really well for me, because then they're just they're focused on the blockers, which is great. That's salesperson's job, is like remove blockers to the sale, but that feedback doesn't normally come back in the sense of, oh, this asset is performing really well, make more of these please. It's more like what's missing. And so that's been a major difference for me personally in terms of making content. Okay, let's get into moving past this world. So the big question is like, what are the signals when it is time to hire an enablement person? When does this start to break down not having an enablement person or team?
So I think it's different for every company, and like just like any role, you can get ahead of things, right? And hire early and try and do things right from the beginning, and hire an enablement person early when you have let's call it a 5-10 person, sales team, and you want to start to add structure here. But I would say most companies don't operate like that, right? Most companies, and this is my preferred approach too, is you should really only hire people when you really feel like pain, right? When it's a desperate need to start to hire and fill out a function, right? When the current team just can't do it anymore. And so you can actually last a pretty long time with a like sort of group-based approach to enablement between those 4 roles we had talked about before, right? Product, sales, leadership, marketing, and operations. But I think like what ultimately will happen, especially at a hyper-growth company, is you're onboarding so many different sales reps like every year, right? And what often happens is you look at your revenue plan, in December for the coming year, and you say, to meet these crazy goals, we're going to need to hire 50 sales reps next year. And that means we're going to need to, or I'll say 60 sales reps. And that means we're going to need to, have 50 sales reps or 5 sales reps every month, start at the company. And then, oh, wow, okay, we're going to need to be training those sales reps. And to hit our revenue goals, we're going to need to ramp them really fast. And then it's like, who's going to do all the training? And you start to look around the room, and it's like, well, the sales leaders could do it, but they're dealing with their own team, and sort of the existing chaos of dealing with everybody. And so that's the moment oftentimes where it's like, wow, we are behind in enablement. We really need to make an investment here. And that's, I think, how it goes down at most companies, is when you start to have these big cohorts of new reps that are joining. That's when sales training specifically becomes most important. And then a more formal enablement function gets built, and then they become the business partner to those 4 functions we had talked about before, and sort of the translator, if you will, between the like sales team and their needs and to those other functions, whether that's product, operations, or marketing.
Do you remember roughly at Lattice when you decided to hire enablement?
I don't, but it was too late. I mean, we were a couple hundred people. Like we were like Series B, Series C, something like that. I mean, like I remember generally what would happen was we had like one of the most important meetings at Lattice. We had this, I forget what we called it. It was like RevOps Weekly or something, where RevOps, shout out Brian Struve, would run sort of a roundtable between marketing and sales leadership, and we would talk about initiatives, right? We would like do our pipeline review. Actually, I think that's what the meeting was called. It was a pipeline review, but then we also would talk about different initiatives, right? And we would talk about like the things that we needed to close more deals, right? Like, what are the pain points in the sales process? How do we need to coordinate between sales and marketing around, like upcoming events or demand gen, things like that? And it just got to a certain point where it was like, wow, we are all really busy in our own functions, like trying to make the thing or trying to sell the thing. And we need somebody who can help connect the 2 teams, and add a little bit more formality to all of it. Because what happens is like, you just start like being like, we have a new thing we have to do. Let's train the team. We have to do this. We have to do that. Like new thing, new thing, new thing, new thing. And sales people and any human in general can only like obtain so much information at a time, and you start to need to add like structure to that chaos. And our first enablement people are brought in, and it's really like our CRO Dee kind of was like, hey, it's time. Like we need somebody that can be a partner to me to help sort of like manage all of these new salespeople that we're hiring.
That makes sense. I'm looking forward to the day we hire enablement at Doc. That is like the elephant in the room, right? It's like we are a sales enablement company, but we don't have an enablement person. But partly because we're able to use our own software and like take away some of those pains, which has been an interesting like side effect of using Doc ourselves.
Totally. I mean, I think good software can help you scale farther without it. And probably the first enablement person at Doc will be like a marketer to help be on this podcast.
Yeah, exactly right. And then in terms of like this post-hire, like do you feel like there was anything you learned at Lattice as, I mean, you were a marketing leader, but anything you wish you had done differently sort of pre-hiring enablement?
I think like information overload was one of the things that we fell into a trap, especially me at Lattice. Like I looked at my role at Lattice and head of marketing is like, I just need to do a lot of stuff. Like I wanted to create a ton of events and a ton of collateral and like just more, right? And I think what I didn't realize was, and I just touched on it a sec ago, but like I didn't realize that like that's not always good. Like it can be really overwhelming. Like what's the thing I need to pay attention to? And I think what our first enablement people at Lattice did really well was sort of, again, add structure to that, is like, how do we disseminate information to the sales team in a really like structured way? And like, learning and training, like there's a real science to that. Like there's people who spend their whole career, right, as teachers, and how do they go about, having you start as a student from, point A and get you to point B. And like, I was not thinking about that at all as a marketer. I don't think our sales leadership necessarily was either too, because they're focused more on like the active coaching and management. And a really good enablement person sort of starts to think about it from a curriculum standpoint. What are the things you need to do to, make someone sort of move through the grades of what Lattice sales, was at the time. And that's where enablement becomes so important. They become that business partner for all those other functions, but then they also are sort of the leader of training and teaching the team, which becomes the most important thing at the company at the end of the day, because the faster you ramp those sellers, the more productive they are, the quicker you're going to hit your numbers as a company.
Perfect. Well, that feels like a great spot to end. The praising enablement leaders. I feel like we can end there. So thanks, Alex, for another awesome conversation. Thanks everyone for listening to the show. If you want to check out the newsletter version of the show, you can go to growandtellshow.com. Subscribe to us on all the platforms. Subscribe on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram. We're everywhere. We're invading your feed. So thanks so much, everyone. And we'll see you again next week.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.